Welcome to the Further Light Podcast, brought to you and presented by Wisconsin Freemasonry, helping you accomplish your Masonic goals through education and more light. And now, I introduce to you Brother Chris Ludke.
This is Brother Chris Ludke, and today I want to explore geometry. Of course, we're continuing down this road of looking at the 7 liberal arts, and as Masons, we are constantly told about the importance of geometry. Masonry, we are told, is synonymous with geometry. Our tools are used in the practical application of geometric principles. Our ritual is replete with mentions of the triangle, square, and circle. But why? What is the connection and lesson we as Masons should take from this liberal art? My goal here is to explore geometry, its history, its role as a liberal art, and how we can understand and apply it to our growth as Freemasons. So as always, let's start at the beginning. What is geometry? Well, according to William Preston, geometry treats of the powers and properties of magnitudes in general where length, breadth, and thickness are considered. By this science, the architect is enabled to construct his plans, the general to arrange his soldiers, the engineer to mark out the ground of his encampments, the geographer to give us dimensions of the world, delineate the extent of the seas, and specify divisions of empires, kingdoms, and provinces, and by it also the astronomer is enabled to make his observations, fix the duration of times and seasons, years and cycles. In fine, geometry is the foundation of architecture and the root of mathematics. Well, he might not quite have that idea of the root of mathematics the right way around, because geometry is part of mathematics. Mathematics comes first. That being said, let's look at what geometry is. In modern day, simply put, geometry is a branch of mathematics that studies the size, shape, and position of 2- and 3-dimensional objects. Although ancient Greek mathematician Euclid is typically considered the father of geometry, the study of geometry arose independently in a number of early cultures. And it makes sense. You need to measure things. Specifically, land in many cases. So let's talk about this history. The word geometry has its roots in the Greek word geometrin, which means earth measuring. Before the time of recorded history, geometry originated out of practical necessity. It was basically the science of measuring land. If you have property ownership, you need geometry. Many ancient civilizations, from the Babylonians to the Hindus, Chinese to the Egyptians, possessed geometric information. The first considerations had their origins in simple observations stemming from human ability to recognize physical form and to compare shapes and sizes. There were many circumstances in which primitive people were forced to take on geometric topics, although it may not have been recognized as such. For example, man had to learn with situations involving distance, bounding their land, constructing walls and homes, figuring out how much material they needed to build the home. These types of situations were directly related to the geometric concepts of vertical, parallel, and perpendicular. Egyptian geometry was not so much a science as the Greeks might have had it. It was more of a grab bag of rules for calculation without any real motivation or justification. It's the practical application without the abstract in the background. Sometimes they guessed correctly, but other times they did not. Ancient people could not escape geometry in the same way that we cannot escape it today. The concept of the curve was found in flowers in the sun. The parabola was represented by tossing an object, and spider webs posed an excellent example of regular polygons. Still, before the time of recorded history, man began to consider situations that were more hypothetical. Procedures such as trial and error, induction, and rule of thumb were being used to discover these new ideas. The ancient Egyptians, Babylonians, and Indians studied and invented certain early geometric principles. but it was the Greeks who took what had been discovered and made crucial advancements that shaped modern geometry. It's really the Greeks that will codify the system. Just because people knew these rules existed doesn't mean that it had really ever been written down or explored, and so the Greeks are going to be the first to do that. We know that the ancient Greeks used their mythological stories to help explain their world. But over the course of their civilization, many scientists, mathematicians, and philosophers began to understand that these stories weren't enough. Studying geometry was one of those pursuits that helped them gain a clear picture of how the world works. Classical geometers like Thales, Pythagoras, and later on Plato talked about things like eternal forms and the axiomatic method, and these principles are still used today. The Pythagorean theorem, which was developed by Pythagoras, is still an essential part of geometry. As ancient Greece developed further into another era, here the Hellenistic, following Alexander the Great, the discipline of geometry gained even more momentum. The likes of Euclid and Archimedes further built on the principles that others before them had developed and studied. Euclid was focused on defining geometric principles, while Archimedes put these principles to use in his inventions. In particular, Euclid created a 13-volume series of books called the Elements of Geometry that describe different principles of geometry, and when we talk about the 47th problem of Euclid, that's what we're referring to. It's the 47th problem in his book, The Elements of Geometry. So why is geometry of any importance today? Geometry helps understanding of spatial relationships. It creates a clear perception of space and position through studying the size and shape of, well, just about everything. It helps comprehend the measurements and relationships of lines, angles, surfaces, and solids found all around us. Geometry allows people to think in shapes and sizes, and do so in a concrete way, to measure them, to understand them. Knowing about different shapes and their sizes allows the mind to visualize new things by building with learned shapes. Geometry can aid in bringing together both sides of the brain. The left side of the brain is logic-driven, technical, while the right side is creative and artistic. This creates a well-rounded, general lover of the arts and sciences, since elements of geometry appear in both the arts and the sciences, especially the visual arts. Geometry can help combine both to create a perfect symmetry between the two sides, either in concrete or in abstract terms. But you're saying, while this is great, I understand more about geometry, what about geometry and Freemasonry? Well, my focus today is on geometry as a whole, and I just want to say that the issues of sacred geometry are not going to be discussed here. Instead, I'm looking at a little bit larger picture. Freemasonry as we know it today grew out of the Renaissance and was established during the time of the Enlightenment or the Age of Reason. Freemasonry has something to do with what is right and true. It's the thing that we're always seeking. One way of determining what is true and what is right is through faith in the revealed will of God as dictated by the authority of the ruling, in this case, religious institution. But there's a second way. So while we can determine what is true and what is right based on holy writings or our religious beliefs, we can do it another way. We can determine what is true through reason, logic, and proof, based on observable evidence, which is the way of geometry. Thus, there are two books from which Europeans 300 years ago might learn a method of how to discern what is true and what is right. They could look at the Bible, for example. Again, we're in Europe 300 years ago. They could look at Euclid's Elements as another way of understanding the world around them. In a way, it's an interesting metaphor. It creates the way of authority and faith versus the way of geometry and science. In 1660, the Royal Society of Science was founded, whose motto was Nullius in verba, take no one's word for it. The establishment of the first Grand Lodge of Freemasonry in London owed much to the Royal Society, whereas the Royal Society focused on science, Freemasonry focused on ethics. To what extent these ideas informed the formal establishment of Freemasonry is left to the interested listener, who may do their own inquiry. So whereas geometry teaches one to observe and to measure and to study measurement, is to study science, whereby one finds the laws of the universe and rules of nature unraveled before them. The argument laid out here is that the discoveries of geometry are not created by man, but rather embody man discovering the rules laid out by the grand architect. Just because you have objective proofs does not mean that you have contradictions. They can work together. We can prove certain things through faith, and we can prove certain things through observation. And that's basically the metaphor that we're getting through geometry. So let's tie this up. Let's see where this leads. Freemasons have, for centuries, held the conception of the universe as the material expression of a hidden reality, an invisible blueprint set down by the hand of the grand architect of the universe in his spiritual, moral, and Masonic trestle board. We have learned that the study of geometry in past civilizations and founding cultures provided the key and the means to render visible that which was concealed from the undiscerned and untrained eye. We can see these elements infiltrating our daily lives and lending way to newer and better understandings of ourselves and the worlds that we inhabit. Geometry lets us measure distance and movement, and perhaps the final liberal art, astronomy, is the ultimate application of these, and all the teachings of the 7 liberal arts.
Are you interested in learning more about Freemasonry in Wisconsin? Visit wisconsinmasons.org. That's WIMasons.org to learn more about Masonry and access further educational content and further light in Masonry. Thank you for listening.